Hello, today is Tuesday, June 21st, 2022. My name is Arlowe Clementine, and I am in Stillwater, Oklahoma, attending this meeting virtually. I'm here with Nicole McAfee, who is located in the Oklahoma City area today for our conversation. I'm with the Oklahoma Oral History Program at Oklahoma State University, and today I am talking with Nicole about their experience during the COVID-19 pandemic in Oklahoma. We will spend most of our time discussing their role as a community organizer, but I do have some general about life during the. We're going to start our interview. Upon the agreement of Nicole, this interview will be archived at the OSU Library for future generations to see. And this project is supported through the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences, the American Rescue Plan Grant Fund. So thank you so much for making this possible. Well, hello, Nicole, and welcome. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
Good. Okay is about as good as we can get these days. So
yeah.
Well, since we just did that formal introduction, I'd really now to give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yes, my name is Nicole McAfee. My pronouns are they and she. I am currently the executive director of Freedom Oklahoma, an organization that does 2S LGBTQIA plus advocacy across the Oklahoma and Indian country. I've been in this role for just about a year now, and before that, did work with the ACLU of Oklahoma, did electoral work before that, but have been in Oklahoma City on and off for about the last 7 years. I grew up in a small town in South Central Texas, spent a lot of time coming back and forth between these two states, and now live here by choice, sort of against all of my original life plans, but with my partner, Andrew, and our 3 cats.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I see one of the babies behind you. Would you like to introduce them for the record?
Yes, this is Brunhilde, who is currently asleep, but maybe up and about.
Awesome. Nicole, also before we move on, I want to just clarify your pronouns and my pronouns for the record. So I use they, them pronouns. What about you?
I use they and she pronouns.
Perfect. My last question, just because I know some neurodivergent queers in my life, I hear a little rustling. I'm not worried about it, but I assume you're probably like fidgeting with something. Is that?
Yes, yeah, that is the case.
Okay, great. I just want to say, like, I want to put that on the record. So when folks are like, what's that noise? Can you explain why you use instruments like that?
Yeah, as someone who is autistic and has ADHD, oftentimes the best way for me to really fully engage requires some like fidgeting and or alternative something to like engage other parts of my brain that might be distracted if I didn't. So it just helps me pay attention to it. There might also be some bassy noise in the background just because it is very warm and it's running best it can.
Listen, thank you so much for that explanation. I think it's really common for noises to happen, and by explaining them, it gives, I think, an extra spot to what we're creating here together today. This is real life, and it can be nerve-wracking to do Zoom interviews. So thank you for being vulnerable enough to share that with me. Awesome. And that was a really great introduction. I am really excited to talk to you about so many things. I'm already overwhelmed because as a queer Oklahoman, you are someone that I look up to in the way that you organize. We've been around each other's orbits for a long time, and I am really excited to hear your perspective on so many things. Let's go ahead and get started by discussing just some basic questions regarding your experience with COVID-19. So we're going to do these sort of chronological. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And these can be as open-ended or as short as you'd like them. This is just so future generations can understand individuals decisions during the pandemic. So do you have memories of first realizing that the pandemic was going to significantly affect your day-to-day life? And when did that happen for you?
Yeah, I think that like February of 2020 is when I, like end of that month, sort of went from knowing a little bit about COVID-19 to knowing enough that I was worried about it and worried about sort of lack of response on the ground. I think I really realized it was going to be sort of like life altering and disruptive to day-to-day life in March of 2020, like that week of March 13th, ahead of when a lot of the United States shut down. For me, that was a week where I had canceled family coming to visit. I had canceled an upcoming trip to New York City. So already sort of saw those life changes, and I was still doing a lot of work at the Oklahoma legislature in the Capitol building. And I remember that week, as I was reading sort of about how severe this was, the mitigation step that they took was to put hand sanitizer out on each floor. And for me, that was the like, oh, this is going to be bad, and we are not close to prepared for this. And that's what we saw play on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk more about working at the Capitol and your work there on the ground during this time a little later. And thank you for sharing that perspective. I imagine being in that giant space and realizing how many folks were in and out of it, and seeing what was or was not happening was a real shock to the system.
Yeah.
Did you wear PPE early? Like, did you take precautions as soon as it was suggested, or how did you start using those sorts of tools? And do you still?
Yes. So I bought masks pretty early on, as soon as that was a like possible suggestion. And like they were fabric masks at first, in the kind of wave of don't take sort of medical grade masks from medical professionals as there is a shortage. And I still regularly wear my mask. I have a pretty solid stockpile of N95 and KN95 masks, both for myself and for other folks I manage and interact with, to make sure that they're as safe as they can be in situations where we are still out in public, as there's pretty regular spread. But yeah, I'm often in rooms here where I'm the only person in a mask, but still definitely feeling solid about making that choice to wear it.
Thank you for that. I often, as an archivist, think about all of the shows of the fashion masks that are gonna we're gonna be showing off years from now of like what we chose. Just like this is sort of silly, but do you have what's the most ridiculous themed mask you bought in the beginning?
My mom sent some masks that are like fabric from TV shows I loved as a kid. So there's like Scooby-Doo and Rugrats masks in my collection. And maybe my like most sort of moment that is captured on camera in a mask. I got engaged during the course of the pandemic. It happened as a surprise at a like outdoor gathering, and we were walking back there. My partner was like, "Oh, you can take your mask off." And I was like, I don't know who else is going to be here, and I know it's outside, but like I just leave it on. And so I am wearing my mask as I'm getting proposed to. And I was like, yes, that feels like an accurate representation of, no, this thing is most important to me, that everyone is safe.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So you talked a little bit about family canceling plans, canceling a trip. How did the lockdowns that happened early on affect your day-to-day activities? And did it allow you to see anyone were you able to see anyone outside of your like individual family unit?
So it immediately changed my work. At the time, I was pretty regularly on a day-to-day basis, either at the state capitol building or in meetings. And the Oklahoma legislature sort of had several stages of response, but there was an initial sort of at least week, I think, of shutdown. And so it meant kind of immediately figuring out what virtual meeting spaces were accessible to folks, and how to continue doing work in a more virtual setup. So that just meant my every work day looked different. I am lucky enough that I am in a single family house situation, so had both space internally and some outdoor space that as things got to a point that they felt comfortable enough, I did some outdoor socially distanced hangouts with people, but always in groups less than 6, always sitting very far apart from one another. So most of my sort of social life either was outdoor, distanced hangouts with other people who I knew were not sort of going out into the world, or lots of sort of Zoom social time.
All right. And let's talk about the Oklahoma City area. What part of town are you located in-ish?
So I live in the Crestwood neighborhood, close to the Plaza District. So kind of in the urban core of the city, but in a space that lots of single family homes, some relatively walkable neighborhoods, and close to a lot of restaurants, bars, small businesses, that were sort of a regular part of my life and part of why we chose here as a place to live.
Thank you. So I'm assuming based on my experience in Tulsa, which is a little bit different, but being in that sort of urban area, did you all have any sort of public mask mandates, or early on, did you see certain parts of the community leveraging wearing masks over other?
Yeah, so Oklahoma City had a mask mandate for a while. And it was contentious even in the beginning. So I helped organize sort of a large group of public who was able at that point in time to give public comment at city council via Zoom, which not all public bodies made that accessible, and it wasn't accessible. It is not still accessible for a lot of folks. But we had a mask mandate for a while. There was a lot of kind of debate about enforcement of it. So the enforcement was fines based, which is not ideal. And I pushed back against that as a mechanism and encouraged sort of education campaigns and making masks more accessible as the other option. But I think even early on in sort of mask mandate and some of the regulations for shutdown of bars and other sort of very social spaces, we saw that politicized, and a pretty varied range of folks respecting or not respecting those mandates that were in place.
Yeah. So that leads me to my final question about the early part of the pandemic. How information was coming from all angles, especially early on, I feel how did you feel about the trustworthiness of information that you were able to receive in the beginning? And where did you get most of your information for your own household, or that informed the work you were doing?
Yeah, I probably I did a thing that it's very much part of my neurodivergent response, was that I sought a whole lot of information and then tried to work to parse through what was the guidance, because I think there wasn't always clear guidance was part of the issue. And pretty early on, I looked at sort of state data that was posted in Oklahoma. I looked at the CDC for information, but where I looked for guidance was sort of responses out of like Singapore and South Korea and New Zealand as places that seemed to be taking sort of the most stringent mitigation guidance that was available. So I kind of looked to those as my okay, this is best example of what we could and should be doing, and sort of worked from there.
Do you think that your international studies education helped you in being able to decipher, looking for information?
Yes, I definitely think that sort of having that comparative politics background was helpful. I also was traveling abroad during H1N1 outbreak in 2009, and that experience sort of influenced how and where I was looking for information, and maybe an extra layer of my desire to be as cautious as possible. When I was in middle school, late middle school, I got breakthrough pertussis, so whooping cough, so despite being vaccinated, because I have always had a less than stellar immune system, was exposed by an asymptomatic carrier, and was really sick and hospitalized for quite a while and still have some lung issues because of that. And so for me, COVID and the lung piece of it in particular was immediately very serious. And I wanted to make sure that I was sort of being as smart and safe as I possibly could be.
I know that it's a difficult question to ask about other people's perceptions, but I think especially folks who were really, really cautious early on, I've heard from a lot of folks that they got a lot of you need to calm down sort of vibe. Was that your experience, or do you feel like the folks around you, knowing about your own personal lung conditions and things like that, sort of neutralize some of that?
So I think I got a mix. I both had a large group of friends who are chronically ill folks, are people who do organizing work, and we're also in the folks are not taking this seriously enough sort of camp. And I think most of the kind of calm down responses I got were to some extent from some people in more nebulous workspaces, and also from some of my family. Most of my family lives much closer together, all kind of in the Austin, Texas area now. And so they did a lot of pushing boundaries, especially with my grandparents who are both immunocompromised. And so a lot of my hey, there's a lot of risk here, feedback was met with, you're being overdramatic. It's just fine.
Yeah. Ooh, what a time. Can you imagine that was just 2 years ago? Oh. Let's move in just a little bit further into the summer of 2020, late spring, early summer. A lot of folks in timelines discuss the murder of George Floyd as sort of another key space in the COVID timeline and the way that the community responded to it. As an organizer on the ground, what sort of what sort of things were you taking into consideration if you were active in sort of the things that happened in response to that in Oklahoma City? And also, did you see anything new, maybe from the community, with COVID sort of being part of the narrative in this new way?
Yeah, so the like balance of my advocacy and my activism and COVID definitely was a regular part of my decision making on like how I felt I could show up in organizing spaces in sort of the immediate aftermath. For me, that meant a lot of not going to protests where I would normally be. So I went to like one in late summer where I was masked. And otherwise, I did a lot of like trying to figure out what support role I could serve instead. So for a lot of protests, I did jail support, where I was folks contact around both like connecting them to potential bail options if necessary, and also letting family members know. So I was the person that they called the number on their arm and did the like, okay, here's the 3 people I need to call in their family if that happens. Like here's conditions that folks bailing people out need to be sort of keeping top of mind, and just tried to like figure out like what my role still could be. I did a lot of live tweeting of things as they were happening and trying to give folks information about where cops were stationed. There were quite a few protests in Oklahoma City where there was movement from one place to another. And that sometimes meant really large police presence that showed up earlier than anticipated or at different locations. And so trying to help get that information out were kind of some of the different roles that I took there. And then did a lot of like policy sort of organizing in response to June is municipal budget month in Oklahoma City, as it is in a lot of sort of cities in Oklahoma. And so because we were still in a timeline where there was virtual comment allowed at city council meetings, I worked with some people on how we could inform people about sort of what our options were, get them as prepared as possible for what giving comment might look like, what were some of the things that they could say and or ask for, and trying to collect some stories on interactions with the police too. So it was a lot of, I want to help support in this space in all of the ways I can, and what does it look like to do that while trying to be mindful of sort of a still changing COVID environment.
Thank you so much for talking about that, like, switch over. As someone who, in my 20s was always, I loved being on the front lines, right? That was like my favorite place to be. But it just like destroyed my body, right? And and I think that that's the case for a lot of organizers. And I do think that COVID did allow us to sort of reposition ourselves of like, where are our skill sets best utilized, and how can we make things work in new ways? Yeah, as you were like live tweeting and things like that, like I was part of a team that would go to the like periphery of marches and just pass out water, right? Or be there to hold space. And yeah, I think that so often we don't really discuss the fact that we can't do everything, either for our personal well-being or for community well-being or burnout or for safety, for so many reasons. So thank you for sharing that. Excuse me. So we're going to fast forward again a little bit to like December of 2020, where, or leading into that winter, where there's a lot more discussions of the second wave of COVID coming. And I know we're going to talk in detail in just a moment about like working with folks who were incarcerated during this time. but I'm assuming that that was a big fear in your second wave planning. But give me a few examples of ways that you doubled down or started to prepare further for the second wave that came.
Yeah. So in my work timeline, going into that second wave was also sort of going into election season. And what that would look like in many years would be a lot of sort of hours of me spent out going door to door, talking to voters in the most sort of face-to-face ways possible, because that is the most effective way to get folks out to vote. And so I was doing advocacy work around state question in Oklahoma, and part of my planning and doubling down was just using the power in the planning space I had to ensure that our get out the vote plan was virtual and phone based, not putting sort of most vulnerable folks in situations where they felt like they had to go do something face to face on the door in places where at that point masks were very, very much partisan and politicized, and where those encounters could be dangerous, sort of in any number of ways, both because people had sort of visceral angry reactions to people who did wear masks, because people were not wearing masks and were not being sort of COVID mindful at that point. The other part of planning for me was we were looking at a legislative session sort of that started in February of 2021, where it seemed pretty clear there wasn't going to be any COVID mitigation in place, that the little mitigation we saw at the end of the 2020 session was pretty short-lived. And looking to 2021, for me, that meant being very clear about the workspace I was in, that I wasn't going to sort of put myself in the space of having to be in that building when there wasn't mitigation, that I wanted to make it clear that that our advocacy sort of continued to be virtual with some distributed organizing options, so that we were supporting people if they were proactively making that choice to go be in that building, but that we weren't ever putting people in a situation where they felt like the only way they had to engage was to put themselves kind of in that harm. So a lot of my planning was, as people were already sort of facing Zoom burnout, how do we continue to engage people? How do we continue to plug them in? How do we plug into this legislative session, and try to do some meaningful advocacy from outside the building, because inside the building is unsafe?
Yeah, what Freedom Oklahoma and the organizing initiatives that you've been a part of during this time have done to increase advocacy for queer individuals in the state is so powerful and so thankful. I was lucky enough to get to participate in a youth-led conference that Freedom Oklahoma was part of, the Warren Zuniga, and that was so getting feedback from young people who were just desperate during that time to have space to tell their stories and learn new ways to advocate was so refreshing. I know for me during this time as a community organizer, getting to connect, but just seeing the multiple ways that you all leveraged certain spaces was really remarkable. Real quick, I do want to ask you a millennial queer question, if you're okay. I try really hard in interviews with queer folks to not force them to identify how old they are. It's something that a lot of us do not want to do, but I will assuredly say are situated as a millennial level queer. Is that correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Okay, great. Talk to me about the shift in yourself with social media pre and post pandemic right here. I think that we're talking enough about that I'd really like to hold space for that. Were you super social media savvy pre-pandemic? When did you discover TikTok? Let's talk about some of those things real quick.
Yeah. So I generally fall into the early millennial adopter of social media, like was an earlier Instagram user, became like a more frequent Twitter user, like had a Twitter in college, did not use it so much. And when I started doing organizing work, realized like what a helpful organizing tool that was. And the first space I remember really like live tweeting and thinking about Twitter sort of as a connecting platform was actually at a Take Root reproductive justice conference that used to happen every year at OU in Norman. And so like that was sort of the start of my too many tweets. And like Twitter was probably the thing I most used, and I largely used it for organizing in and outside of work. Facebook is a platform I had for a while and is probably where I like see and interact with family members on social media most. But I definitely fall into, I think, like very large category of millennials that did not have TikTok until the start of the pandemic. And even then, I think the like first several months I was on it, just sort of passively used it. So watched videos, some like would share videos that I, really loved back and forth with my partner, and not many other people I knew utilized TikTok. And it was, I guess, sort of late November 2020. So sort of post-election. And for me, I had just had knee surgery and was doing all of the like knee surgery recovery things and looking at sort of second wave of COVID that I really started utilizing it more regularly and trying to figure out like how to make a video and how to do sort of video edits on TikTok, and have become a really regular user in that space.
You're not alone there, Nicole. I also, our TikTok timelines are very similar. I didn't start until the summer of 2020. That's when I finally downloaded it, but same thing. I'm still trying to figure out how to, but I have some younger, lovely members of the community who told me once I'm done with my thesis that they will teach me all of the ways. So thank goodness for intergenerational connection, right? Okay, so let's move forward a little bit further again, and let's talk about year anniversary mark and the conversations around vaccines entering the picture. So talk to me a little bit about, do you remember that year anniversary? What were you thinking or feeling? But then also like, what was your take on vaccines? Talk to me a little bit about your vaccination story as you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I do remember that year mark. Maybe especially so because I did a like series of TikTok videos that were like, okay, this is like counting down. Because one of the things I did sort of on, I guess, Instagram was I did like a day, like this is so many days since we sort of first started isolating. So was pretty aware of like when that moment hit. And it was, I think, especially wild for me because like what my life looked like at the year mark was entirely working from home, like still doing grocery delivery, which I felt very like privileged to be able to afford to do that. Not eating out at all. Like when I was seeing folks, it was still outdoors, socially distanced in very small numbers. And yet in the like rare times I sort of went out in the world when that was regular sort of like physical therapy or occasional like follow-up doctor's appointments, it was pretty clear that there were a lot of other folks in Oklahoma City just living life as usual without any sort of mitigation concerns at all. And as someone who got pertussis sort of despite being vaccinated as a young person, I was really eager for a vaccine to be like as protected as possible. That I knew and know that vaccines are imperfect, and that they are sort of the best line of defense that we've got. And with a immune system that doesn't always show up for me in the ways I would like it to, was excited for sort of those extra layers of protection, and excited what that meant for like the folks I did work with who were incarcerated, for my grandparents, who, like, because of other family choices, were put in risky situations more often. So I, like, as an immunocompromised person, qualified for a vaccine pretty early. I drove to Yukon for my like first vaccine. So a little bit, not terribly far, but like a little bit of a trek in order to find one. I was like the youngest person there that was not someone staffing the site. Got some weird, like, why are you here kind of reactions from some of the folks. But got that one, and a month later got my second shot at the Logan County Fairgrounds in Guthrie. I did some like organizing follow-up work to that injection as I was sitting there waiting. Saw someone get turned away because they were a Spanish speaker and there weren't any Spanish speakers on site. So like got immediate follow-up where they ensured that that location was staffed with a Spanish speaker. They ensured that sort of everywhere in Logan County, and the state health department did some guidance statewide, had some information about how people could like call in if there was not someone staffing a site, to make sure that they could do all the agreements that they needed to do in order to get a vaccine. But yeah, I was eager and excited. Was lucky that I did not have too much sort of symptomatic response to vaccines, but felt just enthusiastic about that opportunity, kind of even knowing it wasn't going to change my day-to-day too much.
Yeah. Ooh, tell me about your first COVID test. Tell me about that. What's that?
Yeah, so I didn't have to do one for a very long time, which I was grateful for. My very first one was actually November of 2020 as part of a like pre-op appointment for my knee surgery, because I just hadn't been in any sort of situations until that point, where it was likely I had gotten COVID or necessary for a test. And it was, pretty quick and easy, got results, was cleared to go in for surgery. Yeah, that was, I guess at that point I'd heard a lot of like, it's awful, it's so uncomfortable. And so like going in and being like, oh, like it's not ideal, but it's not as terrible as a strep test in my mind, was kind of a wild experience.
I feel very similar again as like someone with like chronic health concerns who have had to do a lot of tests that are very uncomfortable. I was so worked up. I was like shaking waiting for my first one. And then I was like, oh, that's great. But like, okay, so I feel that strongly. How is recreation? We're almost through with these basic questions. I'm so excited to sort of dig into your professional work and how that has changed over this time. But what has recreation, how has that changed for you? What do you do for fun now?
Yeah, it was really tough because my like favorite things to do pre-COVID were travel, even if that was like day trips. I love food and like eating out and trying new food things. And those were like both pretty quickly off the table. So I did, I think, something that a lot of people engaged in of like trying to find a hobby at the start of the pandemic, like tried some gardening, and I love that so many people really loved that, and it is not for me. I was not meant for like the outdoors. Like tried to get into some cooking and baking, and I can do it and just don't derive joy from it. And so one of the like hobbies that I picked up and like much later in the timeline was beading earrings, and that has been something that I have a lot of joy in, and it's nice to like focus my brain on something like that requires a lot of focus and that requires both of my hands, and I can't scroll social media or like get bogged down in the news while I am doing that. I've always enjoyed photography and have like experimented with film photography some. There are thousands of photos of my cats from spending a lot of time at home with them. And I think too, like some of my hobbying and like things I enjoy doing is just like giving things a try. Like I've gotten into some like graphic design, some by necessity because I've got to figure out how to like make social media graphics for my job, but have also enjoyed figuring out some of that and have enjoyed like making TikToks and creating outfits and sort of figuring out like clothes that bring me joy and not just what I feel like I need to wear.
Well, I think that that's a perfect transition, Nicole, into talking about fashion, which is one of the like, when I was writing down my like tenets things for you, fashion was on. So I'm gonna let you talk about it, but I would love to just like give you my perspective of what I've seen via social media. First with some of your fashion. So as a like larger bodied working class individual, like I grew up working class, I did not have access to cool clothes. A lot of us didn't, and I'm not sure if you like grew up in a fat body or if you know, that has changed over time. But one thing the pandemic definitely did for me, because I also like experiences, which I couldn't do, so that gave me a little extra money to spend money on these like wish list items that I would have never been able to like make space in my wardrobe or budget for. And we share common loves for certain brands of clothing that I know you really advocate for. And it's been really cool to watch your fashion sort of like explode in some ways via social media, and like love your sort of takedown of the idea of professionalism, which I hope you talk about in a moment. But I would just love for you to like hold space for how you feel about clothes, how you felt about them before, and sort of some of the, I would even say let's drop some brand names of some folks that you really like feel confident wearing or supporting since the pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. So I like have always had a larger body than like my peers, and I grew up in a very small town. My public countywide high school graduating class was 14 people. And so to be like someone in a larger body, like it always felt very much like, oh, this is obvious and stands out in ways that I don't want to. Also growing up in a small town meant that like not only did I have parents who both worked for the public school system, which did not mean a lot of like extra money for shopping, but we weren't physically close to stores. Like closest grocery store was 30 miles away. There was a Walmart and a Cato where a lot of like shopping options happened. And to go to a mall, it was an hour and a half from where we lived. And as is still true to some extent, like most places did not carry larger sizes, especially not extended sizes. And if they did, those options were very limited. And so like that plus a very strict dress code at my school, it was then like implemented with a lot of shame around like, how dare you expose your shoulder, were things that I internalized. And then when I went to college was also a time when I was like, as a chronically ill person on new medication, that meant that I gained a lot of weight very fast. And it took a lot of like, and still takes a lot of like conscientious undoing work to figure out like what I'm comfortable in, and to remind myself that I can have like bare arms and exposed midriff and bare legs in summer because it's 107 degrees, but also because I like my body and I like the way it looks. And so for me, like TikTok and sort of second wave pandemic and recovering from knee surgery meant that I was like dealing with some level of depression that often looked like struggling to get up and get dressed. And some of that was just like physically not being able to bend my knee and having a giant sort of brace that I had to accommodate for limited what I could wear for a while. And so as I was gaining some additional mobility, I decided to start documenting what I was wearing as a little bit of a like self-accountability. Okay, this will make me get dressed. And that meant at first sort of revitalizing an old Instagram page that I had started and quickly abandoned in 2016, and then creating TikToks around it. And that just became like easier and more fun as I could strip back some of the like, that doesn't have to mean hair and makeup if that's not what I'm feeling that day, and that the things I'm drawn to can be very femme and also sometimes aren't. And so it like allowed me to really explore gender and like strip away a lot of clothes that I automatically went to because as a person in a fat body, I felt like the best way to fit in was some sort of traditionally like heteronormative business casual femme look that did not draw any attention to the fact that I was there. And as I was then sort of forced to go to in-person things more, it left like some space for, okay, like, is this the way that I dress at home and on TikTok? Like, what does that look like when I have to go into city council meetings or into the state legislature? When oftentimes the way I dressed was to make other folks comfortable, like people who I was asking to do something big or outside of the norm. And I got to like make the conscious decision of like, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm just going to wear the things I want, and they're going to have to like deal with me as a fat, visibly queer, non-binary person who is centering sort of myself and my community and not their comfort. And it's been a real joy to both like take that journey and share some of it online and meet and connect with some other people who are like working through some of those same spaces. And yeah, brands I really love. New Works has been great. It is woman-owned small business that has artwork mostly done by like queer people of color, women, non-binary artists, and is very bright and pattern oriented. I love Nettle Studios, which has a wide range of sizes and does custom sizing and sort of designed with sustainability in mind. Lucy and Yak has been really fun. Lots of like dungarees and jumpsuits, which I very much enjoy wearing. And so it's been fun, and I have had some more disposable income as experiences have been limited. So I also think I am still working through like not doing some clothes hoarding as someone who had limited access for such a long time. Part of my brain is like, oh, I have to buy this thing if I like it, because I'm never going to be able to find another jumpsuit, blazer, dress in my size again. And that's not true anymore. But trying to like, I think, work out the space between wearing clothes I love, like acquiring things that bring me a lot of joy, and figuring out like what a sustainable amount of clothing in my wardrobe is something I'm still working on.
I feel like you are directly calling me out as well, Nicole. But also I think that us, like, obviously we've talked about like the class and the size part of it, but also we're both non-binary. And it's hard to, as someone who doesn't look at clothes in like a standard way anymore, or loves to reimagine what something could become. It's so hard to throw away those clothes that you've had for 12 years that you got at a thrift store for $3, or pass them on to someone else. So I totally get that. Let's talk about gender a little bit, if you're all right with that. Growing up here, I did not have access to knowing about gender fluidity, non-binary identity, really even trans identity. And it's been a very big deal for me as someone who identified as like a fat femme. I used to like joke that I look like fat Miss Honey from Matilda. Like that was the aesthetic I was going for. And as someone who came out literally every day with my words as a fat femme, when I realized the power of my own expression and not being confined in certain ways, it really allowed me to stop having to come out to every person in like this emotionally taxing way. And like folks just know in ways that they had never known before. And I had no idea how intrinsically connected fashion and my gender is and will always be. And I have a feeling, based on little conversations we've had and things like that, that you are in a similar space. So sort of just like talk to me about your experience with gender. Give me words that you want to describe your gender as outside of these like labels that we have to use as well. So just, yeah, give me some of that.
Yeah, I am. It is a like very clear memory I have as a young kid who like enjoyed dresses because they were spinny and flowy, not because they were feminine. Like how many times I was told I was being unladylike, or sort of not performing femininity enough in my childhood. Like that is a thing that is like part of my core memory. And yeah, I think that I like tried to like dress and perform being a woman in a way that met social standards for a long time. Like even as I thought, oh, but I'm doing this in a feminist way, or this is what I want. And so I think like room where I wasn't having to meet other people's expectations sort of in the pandemic and clothes gave me space to say like, yes, sometimes my style is fat femme and sometimes it's like less femme, and it is bright and soft and fun. And I think the like gender pieces came along with that in ways that felt really clear to me and also sort of scary to say out loud. I am really very grateful that two of my great friends and sort of fellow organizers and folks that I've who have brought me into so many spaces and held me both accountable and offered me love and room and grace are AC Pachi and Maury Turner, who are both non-binary. And I had all of the beautiful examples of how they showed up fully as themselves, and also how difficult it was to get people to see them when they did that. And so my first sort of internal reaction was okay, I have this new piece of my identity that I better understand. And is it something I can and want to share? I am in the way that I dress. And are there folks who are immediately going to think that I am not non-binary enough, right? That their definition of that or their image of that is only androgyny. And is that space that I get to take up, that I want to take up? And so that has been a big part of my journey. And I think I both started saying it more and showing up as my full self, and something that helped me embrace gender in a way that felt real was during the course of the pandemic. I did not go to get my hair cut, as was the case with a lot of people. And it meant that I was a person who's mostly have had shoulder length hair at some level my whole life. And in the course of a few years of COVID-19 had hair that was the longest it had ever been, which garnered lots of compliments. And so my first sort of post COVID-19 haircut was something similar to what I'd had before, still longer, but bangs and a shag. And in September of 2021, I inspired by TikTok haircut, right? Here's this TikTok video. I would like this short mullet situation. And it was a really glorious thing to let go of that physical sort of piece that felt like it was holding me back, right? Okay, this is me, this is who I am. And it's been fun to have different levels of shortest hair I've ever had and feel more like myself.
Oh yeah, the transition of my pandemic haircuts as well. I mean, they're wild. And now, I buzzing my hair was on my bucket list for my forever. And I'm so happy that I did it. And I'm so glad you listened to TikTok and you cut that mullet, Yeah, I think so many of us are going to look through this time frame and be oh, look at all these transformations of the way that we see ourselves and allow ourselves to be seen. Real quick, I try not to put my own perspective on folks, but I'm sorry, Nicole, you're getting it multiple times.
Okay.
I just wanted to go back real quick to you talking about your fashion of being bright and soft and all of those things. And I definitely think that that is all true. But some of my favorite parts of your fashion transition, that's what I'm gonna call it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna call it a fashion transition, is body anymore. Does that make sense? I love when you pull out chunky boots, right? Where you can stomp up those stairs as much as you need to, or the shirts that are the t-shirts that you choose to wear in and outside of public spaces that are both potentially very flowery and speaking truth in a way that folks don't allow us to speak truth here. And I think as another fat-bodied, non-binary, AFAB individual, I admire you leaning in to the parts of you that are hard and rugged and rigid and immovable, because that's what makes you a really great advocate. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that to you. So I think it's important too. And if I'm wrong, don't tell me in the interview, tell me later. Okay, well, we could talk about fashion forever, but let's move on. I want to give space to talk about your work in the community overall. And so I'm just going to let you talk for a little bit. So I'm going to just sort of position a few things. First of all, I'd love to know about, in any order that you'd like to talk to me about, moving into your role with Freedom Oklahoma and what that has looked like for you, but also your work with incarcerated individuals. And when we get there, we'll like go into more conversation about it. But I do want to just like give you space to talk about how that work started for you, how it sort of changed during the pandemic, and give you just some space on the record to talk about that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, so I like out of grad school after an undergrad degree in international studies at Texas A&M, grad school, sort of a comparative politics, international focus at Oklahoma State. Did sort of the last thing I ever thought I would do, and inspired by Wendy Davis's filibuster in Texas, said like, what can I do to sort of protect rights on the ground closer to home? And I did electoral organizing for a few years before I went to work at the ACLU of Oklahoma, which was a scary shift for me. Because the ACLU felt like this big institution that I wasn't sure why they hired me at first. And it was just an incredible opportunity. So I started there with their campaign for smart justice, which was an initiative designed to tackle the mass incarceration crisis proactively. So the ACLU always has and still does a lot of responsive work, and kind of in the post 2016 electoral environment received a lot of money and had room to say, what does it look like to take on a proactive piece of work? And that became really focused on decarceration of prisons and jails, and addressing racism as it shows up in the criminal punishment system. And my interest in that, to some extent, was personal. So my youngest sister is 8 years younger than I am. And when she was just starting elementary school, was over at her best friend's house one day, and had an encounter with an older boy who was still also very much a kid, who sexually assaulted her best friend, and threatened both of them at gunpoint. And sort of what happened next is she didn't tell us for a while because they had been threatened that her family would be killed, sort of if she said anything. And so we found out when the county sheriff came and knocked on our door. And that meant then, after she sort of explained to him and my parents what happened, the district attorney came in and told my parents that what justice looked like was this kid being sent to a detention facility for as long as possible. And I remember a lot of the like rage I had at that time, and sort of this like carceral feminist lens of like, serves them right almost, that then like never quite sat right, because what happened was my sister, who was 5 at the time, and her best friend had to like testify in court and go through all of the preparation to testify, but without any support after. So we lived an hour and a half away from any like child psychologist, and there was no funding or support. And so that was just something that they had to carry with them. This kid who caused the harm was sent to a detention facility an hour and a half away from where we lived, which made it hard for his family to see him. and no one asked sort of, where he saw that harm modeled, the harm it caused to cause harm to other people. And then he was in a detention facility where he didn't see family regularly. And I just think about sort of all of the additional layers of trauma. And so my desire and drive was, we've got to fix this. It's not working right. And the work I started at the ACLU felt like an opportunity to do the criminal justice reform work that I wanted to do at the time. In a COVID context, that looked like trying to do the best to advocate for people who were often sort of last on the list of folks a lot of people wanted to advocate for. So I spent a lot of those first weeks of March, on calls at all hours of days and nights, drafting example executive orders and sending them to the governor's staff about the action he could take to release people, about trying to figure out any room in our sort of medical parole process and our aging parole process, for people to be released. A lot of trying to get reporting out of Department of Corrections and out of county jails. And we got some of that reporting out of Department of Corrections. They built a site with different iterations of how much information they make public, but we never got any reporting out of jails. There's no sort of accountability in that space where people are much more at risk of exposure because of the number of folks who cycle in and out of a jail on a daily basis. And we thought we had some wins. Governor Stitt announced pretty early on that there were going to be 400 folks released. And we felt great about that, and turned around a day later and said, oh, no, we did that calculation wrong. We're going to release less than 100 people. We saw some immediate action on jails. That should be action that happens all of the time. So folks who don't pose a threat of harm, who were in jail simply because they couldn't afford sort of an arbitrary money bail amount tied to their charge, pre-trial, who were allowed to be released, so not all of them, in larger counties especially. But it was a lot of difficult work that, as much as we tried idea generation and advocacy at different people who had power in the process, there was not as much movement as we wanted. It was much slower than we'd hoped for. And even when things like COVID vaccines became available, the state did not want to make them available to people who were incarcerated early on, and didn't do deep work to educate people about vaccines. So we're talking about a population of folks who already have limited access to outside information, who are pretty scared about COVID-19 because there were lots of large-scale outbreaks in prisons across Oklahoma, who haven't seen their family much, if at all, over the course of the pandemic because visitation was shut down. In some facilities, folks couldn't even use the phone regularly because phones were in areas that required sort of larger public access, and it just was deemed too much of a COVID risk. Mail was delayed, especially when sort of initial COVID response assumed that COVID could be spread by sort of particles on surfaces. So just people who don't have the information they need to make a informed decision, who don't trust the medical staff at Oklahoma prisons, and with good reason, and who are now having to decide whether or not to get a vaccination, with kind of all of the layers of biases and politicization of vaccinations that exist for Oklahomans at large, sort of recreated in microcosms in prison. And so sort of even in the moments where we finally got vaccines in there, vaccine rate was pretty low. There wasn't much of a push from DOC to try to encourage folks to get a higher rate without scaring them or trying to like take people's rights away to make their own decision about the healthcare they accessed. And so that was definitely a like tough piece of my ACLU of Oklahoma work. And I think the other tough piece for me was the more work I had done in Oklahoma prisons and jails and with people who had been incarcerated and their family members. The more organizing work I had done sort of in response to the murder of George Floyd, it became increasingly clear that like my political position had moved, and that to me, there is no fixing the system. There's no version of the criminal punishment system that is going to be fair or equitable or serve justice. It exists to punish people, to respond after harm has already happened by perpetuating more harm. And as I sort of became more of a prison abolitionist, it made some of my ACLU of Oklahoma work a little more difficult. Like, where do I draw these lines for myself? How do I advocate in a way that is true to balancing like the real harm reduction work of what are the reforms that get people some level of relief right now, but don't reinforce the system. And so I was dealing with that, and at the same time seeing sort of an increasingly large number of policy attacks on 2S LGBTQIA plus people more explicitly. Not that our community isn't disproportionately harmed by a lot of the other bad policy, but we were seeing national trends repeated on the ground here, or led on the ground here oftentimes, increasingly attacking our community.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Could you give us a few examples of the legislation that was coming down that you saw happen?
Yeah. So, and just like, I guess in the context of the Oklahoma legislature too, a place where there's no shortage of sort of civil rights and liberties violations, and where there's a lot of harm perpetuated. In the 2019 session, we saw no explicitly anti-2S LGBTQ plus legislation, which was a relief and unusual, right? It was like, did all of the homophobic, transphobic legislators forget to consult each other about who was filing the bills this year? But we went from that into sort of seeing bills attacking trans youth in sports. So a lot of these single sex, gender exclusionary bills really targeting kids especially, and using like professional athletics as this example to perpetuate this harm against young trans kids. And so we saw some level of movement on that in the 2021 session, and stopped it largely by luck and timing. And it came sort of with talking points and context that made it pretty clear that there were going to be more attacks on trans folks in the next year. And the ACLU is an incredible organization that does a lot of work, and as an org that has sort of a whole bunch of different buckets of policy to respond to, the limitations of how I could show up for my community were pretty clear. And there was an opening at Freedom Oklahoma. Stepping into an executive director role was and remains a little terrifying. It includes a lot of parts of the work I don't enjoy, fundraising being first and foremost in that. But it was also an organization that had started as a policy advocacy organization and not been able to do much of that because of limitations of staff or budget or knowledge. And So for me, it felt like a moment where I could step into this role and continue the previous executive director's work with Alex Shin, who is a friend and someone I very much admire, and also bring sort of more of a policy expertise and a desire to do some deeper organizing work into this space. And so sort of all of those conditions as they were, applied for the role and started in like late August of 2021, just ahead of the worst legislative session we'd ever had for 2S LGBTQIA+ people.
You're real good at timing, Nicole. Clearly right on time. Oh, goodness. Well, before we move on, I just want to thank you for moving in and being brave enough to do work that way. As someone who's been a community organizer, literally one of the things I say that I will never do is be an executive director. And I know that that's not true. One day I will be, for all of the same reasons. It takes a special sort of person to put aside not only like, you have to put aside part of yourself for the larger mission. And so as a queer Oklahoman who is actively being protected and held space for by the work that you do at Freedom Oklahoma, like, thank you for that. Because I know it would be easier to just never have to do those sides of it, at least personally.
Yeah.
I thank you for sharing all of that too. I knew that you had worked with the ACLU and were active in helping folks who were incarcerated. But I feel like the first time I sort of saw that like publicly through my social media channels was around the conversation with Julius Jones. And so I wanted to make space here, as that is like such a time sensitive Oklahoma narrative, for you to just talk about Julius and what has happened, and yeah, tell me about that.
So Julius Jones has a story that unfortunately is not uncommon. As a young Black man with a previous history of interaction with police in Oklahoma City, was picked up after a crime, after someone had been killed, and despite sort of not matching most of the physical descriptions of the likely person who caused that harm, faced all of the barriers to a fair trial and ended up with a death sentence. So had a public defender who was going through a lot of their own personal issues, who was overworked and under-resourced, and did not allow Julius to take the stand and tell his story. All of this happened under an especially harmful and dangerous district attorney administration that has seen a really high rate of folks sentenced to death who are later determined to be innocent. And then was incarcerated on Oklahoma's death row, and quickly became familiar with all of the limitations of a criminal punishment system and actually undoing harm once that sentence has been doled out. And so I first became familiar with his case because of ACLU work. One of the attorneys working on his sort of last plea, his last attempt to save his life, knew one of the folks at the ACLU of Oklahoma who was doing some sort of post-retirement legal work for us in a way that was too relatable to me. Retired like 2 weeks later, was like, I feel like I need to be doing something. And so came to provide us some support. And so we were connected with Julius's case and with CC Jones Davis and folks who were trying to advocate for some level of clemency. Maureen Turner was working with me at the ACLU of Oklahoma at the time and was kind of the liaison in a lot of those meetings. And so I heard updates from them. I watched kind of the documentary specials that were put together to tell Julius's story, and all of the work was always urgent because Julius has been incarcerated for more than 2 decades. He spent more of his life now in prison than he has outside of prison. But it became increasingly urgent during the pandemic when, after the federal moratorium on the death penalty was lifted, we then saw Oklahoma decide that they were also going to resume executions, which had been paused in the state after execution where someone suffered a lot of very physical pain. And after that was documented by media and there was enough pressure for the courts to step in. And unfortunately, this time the courts did not step in and stop it. They allowed executions to resume. And so it was, I think, especially jarring for me at a moment where there was still so much narrative and so much work trying to save people's lives in a COVID sense, to then see sort of active engagement in killing of people, many who have caused some level of harm and who were themselves vulnerable and had faced just so much consistent lack of support or community when that is what they needed in their lives. And so I had done some work around Julius's case, and to some extent felt like as much as I could, which was kind of some passive support, showing up where I could, sharing information where I could, trying to be a connector to different folks who may have the ear of people who may be helpful, and trying to figure out what a clemency hearing could look like. But as it became more urgent for me, it also became more urgent. And I made that this is the place that I am willing to put myself most at risk in a COVID sense, to show up in any way I can, because I can't let the state of Oklahoma kill this man, and I would like to stop the state of Oklahoma from killing anyone. But this is a fight that needs me. And so I think it was really just incredible to see all of the organizing groundwork that had been done over the course of years, the storytelling, the getting people familiar with his case, that community members, unpaid community members, were able to leverage to get folks to show up, whether that was standing outside in the freezing cold across from the Pardon and Parole Board, or occupying the legislature. Folks were there. And so that meant showing up to the Capitol the week of the execution every day. And I got that first text message that said, "Hey, can you be here? Julius's mom is going to try to meet with the governor, who has refused to talk to her, to ask him to take action on the recommendation that Julius not be executed from the Pardon and Parole Board." And I did a little bit of, I have meetings. I'm in this new role that isn't explicitly criminal justice reform oriented, and kind of immediately just said, it doesn't matter. I will be there, whatever it takes. I made a sign out of a cardboard box in my car and showed up to the Capitol and tweeted about it. And maybe 30 people showed up that day. And each day of that week, it just grew. And there has never been a time in all of my organizing work where I just so deeply felt that like folks got it and that there was real community that I think still exists in that space and in this work, who like were willing to do whatever was necessary to disrupt this execution. And that included a whole group of us who showed up in McAllister on execution day when we were still waiting on a response, and just like folks who were willing to put their bodies on the line in whatever way it took because they couldn't let this happen. And it resulted in a last minute decision by the governor not to move forward with the execution. And also an executive order that said Julius could never be released from prison. So a change in sentence essentially from execution to death by incarceration. But it meant more time to fight. It meant that after 2 decades of not being able to hug her son, Julius's mom got to go to McAllister that weekend and hug him and sit with him in the same room. And that those goodbye calls didn't have to be goodbye. And so it's hard and heavy still because he is alive and still not home, but he's alive, and there are a lot of people that came together to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for holding space for Julius and telling that story for the record. Oh, well, we are going, it is 3:30 and this is our like safety time window now. So I want to just ask you a couple more questions so we can end on a positive note for the queer culture and for talking about COVID, but I wanted to make sure you have time for that before we move on.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're going to end with like a pandemic, like a final big pandemic question. But before that, especially with all of the millennial queer talking that we did today, I wanted to hold space again on the record for some of your favorite like pandemic specific queer cultural things that have happened that you love, whether it be music or television or something like that, that has helped you get through some of this time.
Yeah. I think the first thing and the most on brand maybe is the election of Representative Mauree Turner. To see a queer, non-binary, Black, Muslim person elected in Oklahoma as the first non-binary legislator in the country was incredible and joyous, and their work is so hard, and it's also just a joy to like show up in that building and to know that there is a queer non-binary person who is speaking truth to power and taking up space in a place that is really hostile to that being a regular occurrence. And so they continue to give me just a lot of joy in that space. Our flag means death.
Perfect.
Has been just such a lovely, joyous cultural moment, and watching all of the like queer fan art in real time and seeing most of that in really queer discussions on TikTok is truly such a gift.
Absolutely. I've watched it like I'm actually embarrassed to tell you how many times I've watched it through, because it's like whenever I'm sad, it's like our flag means death will fix it for a minute at least.
Yeah. I think my other Brandy Carlisle released a new album, and my first concert in the COVID timeline happened in September 2021 outdoors at Red Rocks Amphitheater in Colorado, and Mavis Staples opened. So like sang us a lot of really great like Black protest songs in addition to her body of work, and talked a lot about her like childhood experience in civil rights spaces. And then Brandi Carlile came out and gave us a really incredible queer performance, and the audience was just almost entirely queer. And I was there with two people who I was in a sorority with, who are both like out and queer now, and none of us had that experience when we were in college together. And it was just like the music and the like experience of that moment is not something I will forget.
Have multiple friends who were at that Red Rock show. So it's going to be part of a lot of queer people's concert timeline in this part of the world. And just for the record, because we're talking about Brandi Carlile, a little bit of Oklahoma's there too. You know, the twins that play with her, they're from here. They're from they have Oklahoma roots. And
I did
so
not know that, but I love that.
I love telling people about Oklahoma roots as often as I can. Yeah, the twins are from the Tulsa area, I believe, and spent a lot of time here before working with Brandi. Awesome. Thank you for that. And I'm sure there will be so much more. We know that in times of tension, especially queer content gets so much better. We're so funny and good at like all the things, you know. Anyway, okay, so last sort of big this is your ender for today, Nicole. Not forever though. We're definitely going to talk more, but so often we talk about like the horrors of the pandemic and things like that. And I know that the pandemic has also brought you some clarity for a lot of people in a lot of ways. So I would really just like love to end it with a two-parter. I love two-parter questions. The first is, tell me some good that you know came out of this for you and our community. And then give me one of those like, in 5 years, where do you think the state of queer Okie organizing or community will be, and how can people help us get there?
Yeah, I think like one of the first good things that comes to mind is that sort of all advocacy spaces immediately had to become much more accessible for so many more folks. And I know it's going to be a fight to like keep it that way. But it has been incredible to just connect with people that if things had continued in sort of the same inaccessible formats they always did, I would have never gotten to meet or organize with. And I think that there's so much innovation that has been demanded of this moment, but that queer folks especially have used to say, like, how can we create community for folks that have never had that in person, really? And so that is certainly a good thing. I also think that, like, one of the things that I continue to enjoy and think we will see more of is just people refusing to go back to like standards of professionalism and like dress that don't serve them. There are a lot of more people choosing like things that are functional and comfortable for them and bring them joy. And I hope that that just continues to create more space for folks to figure out like those pieces of themselves that they've never gotten to dig into, and to show up sort of more as our whole selves. So there's like more collective safety to begin to do that. I think the like 5 years, I know in a lot of ways can feel a little scary right now because of the like policy timeline we're in. And I always have so much hope for queer and trans and two-spirit people. that I think 5 years from now, we are going to see just organizing networks and community spaces that we couldn't have dreamed of. I think we are having to like fight our way through it, but we will be in a space where we're not using the tools that have been used to oppress us to oppress one another. That there's a lot of room to dig into that in community and to stop policing one another, and to really figure out how we address harm and hold space and hold each other accountable. And I think that every article right now that says, oh my gosh, there's more queer and trans folks than there ever has been, is just going to get to a point that it's sort of normalized that those articles don't have to be written. Just like, of course, we've always been here. We will always be here. And now that you've realized that we're all here all of the time, all around you, we're gonna make space to keep ourselves safe.
Yeah, TikTok actually this morning, Nicole told me, a researcher on TikTok told me that Pew Research just did a survey, and people under 30 years old, 5% of them are identifying as genderqueer, non-binary, trans, somewhere on that spectrum. And, you know, I don't math very well as a LGBTQ plus person. That's not my strong suit. But I do find hope in that. The idea, you know, they just kept saying like 1 in 20, 1 in 20. And in a place like Oklahoma, that's like excellent news for collective safety and for visibility. And yeah, I know you're right. I got all the hope in the world for us too. I know where our roots are, even though they try really hard to hide them. So, and I know you do too, and you're doing the work. So I just want to thank you again, Nicole, for making this space to meet with me. I know that it is wild out there and that you are doing 1,000 things all the time. So I appreciate that. Any final words of wisdom that you would like to leave on the record?
I guess just that I think it is like somewhat wild to think about like reflecting on the pandemic as we are still in it. And that it looks like we're still going to be in some stage of it for a while. And just that I hope as folks encounter this, it's because this timeline has continued to demand innovation, but also because we've organized towards better ways to keep each other safe and well and healthy, as much as possible.
That's a mic drop one, Nicole. I'll take that. Today again is Tuesday, June 21st, 2022. I'm Arlowe Clementine here with Nicole McAfee, speaking for the COVID collection for OOHRP at Oklahoma State University. Thank you so much.
Thank you.